This is the Music Maestro Podcast with me, Dan Fisk, where we deep dive into the stories and strategies behind the industry's most influential figures. Today, I'm joined by Dan Roy Carter, an entrepreneurial powerhouse in music and marketing, from leading campaigns for Avicii and Zara Larsson to shaping TikTok's music promotion strategies across the UK and Europe. Dan has done it all. He's now set to launch Carter projects focused on serving independent artists and labels. So let's hear his journey and his insights today. Dan Roy Carter, how you doing, mate?
I'm very well. What an intro. Thank you very much for having me.
It's all good, man. First question I've got for you. Dan Roy Carter. Is Roy your middle name?
Roy is my middle name. It's my father's name. And it's just been one of those things where since I was young, I've insisted on people using my full name. It's very pretentious.
It's funny because on Facebook, if you search me on there, which you probably haven't done, I'm Dan Leon Fisk, and Leon is my dad's name as well. I used to use it, but I've kind of sacked it off recently. So, okay, Dan Roy Carter, great to have you on. Looking forward to talking about various things. I mean, you've got quite a diverse career, I would say, probably the most diverse we've had. What I'd like to do is you've had this interesting journey where you've kind of gone from journalism then into the music industry, and we'll get onto that. But before you got into the whole journalism thing, which you did at university and then at the early part of your career, was there anything earlier in your life that kind of drew you towards music, or in fact the music industry?
I mean, I think in the first instance, it was the one thing I was knowledgeable about and that I was good at, which, I think as a kid, whether it's at school or, within your social circles, everyone's looking at what you're good at. And, I was a guitarist and a drummer and have been since I was 10 years old. And it was just that point of expertise. And it was the first time I could talk about something, I think, with authority and have the confidence to give my opinion or to deep dive and analyze music. And so I just rode that wave, really. And then very early, sort of age 13, 14, I had this opportunity to give writing about music on quite a big stage ago. So I actually wrote a couple of pieces for Kerrang magazine when I was just about to turn 14.
Wow.
Which, I mean, my parents at the time were very cautious about it. I don't think, they didn't think it was legitimate. Why did they want a 13-year-old to write about metal music and such? But suddenly, next thing you know, I'm printed in Kerrang magazine, age 14. Yeah. And there's something about seeing your words in a publication, let alone one that's as influential as Kerrang, and one that that was my Bible growing up, you know. So I think that was the bug. As soon as that happened, I thought, right, okay, I'm good at this. I've got a platform. I've got something to work from now. Let's see where we can go with this.
Okay, so your intro into journalism then was actually music journalism.
Yes.
Yeah. Which kind of, I guess, led into the journalism thing, which then went a bit broader, I guess.
Definitely. And I mean, I think once I started doing those sort of little spots for Kerrang and that, I had the opportunity to do more formal work experience placements, which is where I got to work with The Independent, and I did some other bits at sort of regional newspapers and such. And to be honest, I think very early doors I kind of worked out, okay, traditional journalism isn't necessarily as fun as music journalism, but... What
is traditional journalism?
That's it, newspaper journalism, let's call it.
Yeah.
The court reporting at 10 a.m. and, Guildford Magistrates Court and things like that. Yeah. But it gave me the skill set and it gave me the chance to sort of develop. And so I learned a lot about the law. I learned a lot about media relations and things like that. So while at the time I thought it was boring and I just wanted to go and write about a gig or an album or something, the skills I was picking up in traditional newspaper journalism actually ended up paying a lot of dividends, I'd say, long-term in my carear. But as a kid, of course, I didn't see it that way.
So when you started off so early, or so young, I should say, at 14 years old, you've then gone to do a degree in it, which, how old are you then? 2019, 2021?
So that'd be 19 till 21.
And so that's quite a big... So you 14 all the way up to 21, journalism was your thing?
I assumed I was either going to be a journalist or a rock star.
Okay.
And then I very quickly worked out that it probably wasn't going to be a rock star. I saw guys that I grew up around, like You Me at Six, a great local band who did make it and were able to break through, saw what they were doing, thought it was great. By the time I got to university, I was quite torn because I was getting this education, but I felt like where I was in my career, I was sort of already a bit ahead of the curve. I was starting to do more in the digital media space. And I felt like the curriculum I was studying wasn't quite up to date, to be completely honest. And a lot of the places I went to do work experience in that period, like Manchester Evening News, for example, they were only just starting to really get their heads around digital. And I don't know, it felt like newspaper journalism and current affairs, let's say, were a bit behind. And I was able to jump on far more interesting platforms, I think, with music. So, for example, podcasting and online blogs and things like that, which is how I ended up sort of doubling down and graduating to stuff like Dancing Astronaut and Beatport and their editorial offerings.
Okay. Well, so obviously you did your journalism degree, and like you just touched on, you were doing bits with Dancing Astronaut. Let's go to the earlier part of your career where you were working with some like the Independent and the Liverpool Daily Post. Let's touch on that.
I mean, it was just about learning as much as I could. And I think I was in a position where until I went to university, I wasn't really sure where I was going to fit. And I wasn't sure if journalism was going to work out, but at least I knew that I was good at it and that I had the opportunity. I was privileged in that I had parents who were pushing me to sort of find something that A, I enjoyed and that B, I could make a career of. But then also I had these opportunities to go to these places and kind of prove myself. And that's what you do in those early days. I think whether you're a kid or a student, like you've got to go and prove yourself. And I was spoiled, as you know, you read my resume, I was spoiled for opportunities to go and get the experience and prove myself. And it all comes together. I think you come out of a phase like that and you go, right, well, I liked this part. I didn't like this part. I was good at this part. I'm lacking in this part. And so I think it was probably a sequence that started a very self-aware phase for me. And I think that self-awareness eventually turned into self-belief.
Yeah.
And I think that's been probably the reason that I've been able to have the career I've had.
Yeah.
It's that sequence, but there's a proving ground.
Yeah. Okay. So what I've just realised actually is your time being an editor or a reporter at those, what would you call them, publications? Is that what?
Publications, newspapers.
Yeah. You're doing that in conjunction with your degree at uni, right?
Yes.
And so what I notice here is The House That Dan Built, which was an independent online electronic music publication, turned into a fortnightly podcast series. This is your thing, right? The House That Dan Built?
That's my thing. That was me basically saying, right, I now want to double down on a genre that interests me at the time and that I have access to. And it was while I was in university. I remember I was sat in my dorm room the day it launched. I launched with an interview with Roger Sanchez because he was doing a show at Ministry of Sound, if I remember correctly. And I emailed his publicist begging for an interview. And they said, yep, sure, send over some questions. And so I did.
Quality.
And I self-published that interview. I think it got something like 50 clicks or something that opening week. And, you know, really...
Our podcast.
Really set the world alight. But no, and that was from there it started because I was like, right, hold on, if I can do that, all I had to do was ask.
Yeah, mate. I mean, listen, the hustle started early then. What I was going to say though is you touched on the Kerrang and rock, that kind of sound. How have you gone from the Kerrang sound to this electronic dance music?
Basically, I got typecasted. To be honest, it was that age where I'm 18, I'm going to more clubs, I've found a taste for that scene. I really enjoyed what certain guys were doing in the Netherlands and in Sweden as well. And so I started writing about that because at the time I could see the cultural relevance. I could see how it was engulfing my social life, certainly, and such. But then, to be honest, I just did a lot of work in there. Suddenly got a reputation for being able to talk to these DJs and producers on the level and sort of, you know, actually have interesting conversations around a genre, I guess, that not a lot of people were having conversations about because it's four to the floor club music, right?
Yeah, totally. Okay, so let's stay here then with this kind of this dance music thing that happened for you, or this interest that went from you starting this publication. Then you've gone on to start your own creative media company. You're working with Mark Knight and Dancing Astronaut, ultimately At Night Management, Avicii's management company. Let's go through, I guess, your time. How did these opportunities come about?
So it really came through the doors that the House Dan Built opened. And so I was interviewing people, I was writing things about their music and such. And I think certain people liked the way that I was writing about it. And so that turned into copywriting roles, which then evolved into more sort of editorial and content roles, and that's how I started working with guys like Tiesto. I ended up doing a lot of work for Spotify when they were launching their internal apps, which didn't last very long, if I'm completely honest, but it was still a great project and a great opportunity to see how my skill set could be used in the context of a product rather than just a DJ or an artist, right? And so it all sort of stemmed from that. And then, to be honest, the first person that really ever paid me for my work in that respect was Steve Angelo. And then to this day, I have nothing but love for Steve, because he was the first person that said, hey, I want you to pay you essentially to do all of our press releases, all of our blurbs, all of our marketing material. Tell me how much you need. And I remember telling him how much I needed, which at the time I thought was a lot of money. And he just went, okay, I definitely should have asked for more money.
Yeah.
It was a bit too easy, if you know what I mean. But
okay.
I mean, I still to this day, nothing but love for him, because he was the first person out of all of that lot that said, I think your skills are worth paying for. And
Amazing.
I think that gave me the belief to say, right, okay, here's some money finally. This, this passion that, to be honest, I've sunk a lot of time and money into is starting to pay dividends. Let's keep riding the wave. Yeah.
Okay. So is this, when you're, that example that you're talking there with Steve Angelo, is this Carter Creative Media
That
time?
was under Carter Creative Media, yes.
So then how did I guess then you've got your press and promotions manager for Mark Knight. Did this naturally come off the back with everything that you were doing with Carter Creative Media?
Yeah, so the role with Mark was my first full-time music role. And I'd been umming and ahhing about whether it was even the right thing to do in terms of going full-time in music. There was so much promising stuff happening, but I hadn't quite worked out if it was going to pay the bills, you know what I mean? Or if it was actually going to be a long-term career. And I think the conversation I had with Mark and his team was actually in Miami. I'd flown out there to see some friends around the same time as the Winter Music Conference. We knew each other from, I'd done some copywriting projects for Toolroom previously. And he just put it to me that they were looking to bring it in-house. They were about to celebrate Toolroom's anniversary, and they wanted to do a lot of very Mark-centric stuff around that. And so it made total sense. So I came in only on a fixed-term contract just to really see how I felt about it and how it worked out. And it was a great spell. And then straight off the back of that, there were a lot of offers, to be honest. And the one I ended up going with was At Night Management.
Let's talk about At Night Management then. I guess you've got a 4-year stint here. I believe it could be short or longer.
So I moved out to Stockholm in 2014.
Right, okay.
I started working with them a bit earlier in a more sort of informal capacity. But I moved out to Stockholm in 2014. I was head of marketing and publicity for 2 and a bit years there. Let's talk about the kind of roster at Night Management. Who obviously Avicii's the big headline there, but who else was under their management? So as well as Tim, we worked with an act called Cazette, who we also released through Pyramid Records, which was a record label that we owned within that whole suite of it. We had a hip-hop artist called Ishi, which was amazing because that was my first hip-hop project, and got to work with the likes of Pusha T, Raekwon, all of those guys, which was, for me, like being a kid in a candy store, to be honest. And then there were lots of people who popped in here and there, like Wyclef, who we ended up working with for ages as well, which was quite surreal and such. And then eventually Axwell and Grosso joined the roster as well. I think. So
in that time, then you've then covered the whole of the Swedish House Mafia. Right?
Yeah, I know. I really wish I'd had all 3 of them at one point, we segmented. So.
Okay, so here at Night, you're head of marketing and publicity.
Yes.
Okay, so explain what that entailed.
So that was essentially a mixture of sort of coordinating with the label teams that were working with our specific artists. I mean, so Avicii was signed to Universal, of course, and such, and so I originally went into that role assuming I wasn't going to have much input or anything to do with that project, and then as the role unfolded, it turned out there was quite a lot to do, and that's no shade to Universal, that's more to the size of the project and how many different stakeholders there were involved, and really keeping the marketing plans, the press, like the things that were happening around specific releases sort of in check. So Stories was his sophomore album, was the big one for us, which actually is 9 years old today. How crazy is that? Literally today I got a reminder on Facebook. It made me feel very old, but also very nostalgic.
Amazing.
And so it was things like that. And I mean, I really loved the role because I got to market in the studio. My desk was right behind the big studio, which Tim would use when he was in town. We had
Amazing.
the Cassette Boys and Axwell and Grosso there. And sometimes if I needed to pick their brains or get on top of something, I just got to sit in the studio with these folks.
Incredible.
And market from the studio. And that was my favourite way to do it.
Yeah.
And it was just, I look back on it, I didn't realise what a special chapter it was, I think, until I got a bit older and, hindsight and all of that. But we had such a unique roster, I think. I think we were very creative, and we had a huge team around us who were, very creative with the way video was used. We were always really pushed to innovate where we could and not just accept the industry standards. And I think that showed in the sort of the standard of content that Tim had throughout all of his music videos and things like that. Some of the marketing activations we got to do, which, to be fair, some of them were a complete train wreck. I remember one we did where we got a bunch of animatronic crows that would play their record, and we put them all over places in ADE. But it turns out the people that get rid of the trash in Amsterdam are way more efficient than the UK. So I think those crows lasted about 20 minutes.
Quality.
If that. And so
Quality.
Luckily we got photographic evidence. But yeah, that's stuff like that, where, we got to trial and error. And most of it, luckily, was incredibly successful.
What an incredible opportunity. In 2016 then, you founded Unapologetic Group. This is your leap into entrepreneurship, right? I guess possibly your second, because you did Carter Creative Media before. But what led you to make that big leap, basically?
I think I'd been given so many opportunities and so much freedom at night to work with a dance artist who was essentially being treated as a pop artist, right? And then I'd also been able to work on hip-hop records as well, and some pop records too. And so I felt like the way that my skill set in marketing and promotion had generally evolved meant that I could work with a wider spread of artists and different types of artists and labels. And so for me, it was a graduation, really. And I think getting to do so at that time meant I came straight out of At Night, and I think within 3 months, my first 3 clients were Rehab, Zara Larsson, and an artist called Julie Bergen, who many listeners probably haven't heard of, but in Norway was having one hell of a moment with a record called Arigato, which I jumped on and helped them internationally with. And so, again, right place, right time, right skill set. And I think that's probably one of my strongest suits, I think, in the entirety of my career, timing.
What were the like? Obviously, like I said, you are an entrepreneur. You've kind of had your fingers in many pies, so to speak, over the years. But the challenges of setting up your own thing, what were the kind of challenges that you faced early doors?
All of the stuff the tax agency sent me was in Swedish. And my Swedish was inte så bra at the time. And yeah, to be honest, setting up a company is daunting at the best of times. Doing it in a foreign country where you're still getting to grips with the language, that was a big challenge for me. Luckily, within the first year, I was able to build the infrastructure and find a good accountant, find people that could help me navigate all of that, for sure. I think as well, sometimes first-time entrepreneurs or first-time company creators maybe struggle with packaging what their actual offering is. So you can assume that people know what you do and what you're good at. And I still to this day have to check myself on this, because just because you have a skill set that people know you from, that doesn't mean they necessarily know what you offer. And so maybe you assume that going into conversations, it's going to be a done deal, that they're going to be like, right, we want to work with you, you're great, this and that. And I think especially in those early days, you've really got to get your shit together in terms of like, right, this is what I do, this is the value I offer, and this is why you should work with me. And I was a bit spoiled in the first instance, where I had a few people out the door who just wanted to work with me and I could crack on. But then I remember when it came to scaling and growing it out, there were certain conversations where you'd sit down with somebody expecting it to be all positive and such, and they'd be like, so what do you actually do? And you're like, oh God, hold on, how do I explain this? How do I do this and such? And so that kind of pushed me to really work out what I was doubling down on, and that ended up being what I call platform marketing. So essentially like how you market with specific platforms, so Spotify, Apple, YouTube, eventually TikTok. That became the focus point, but it took a few years to get to that point. And I think if I was going to try and give advice to people doing it now, I'd say get your elevator pitch locked down before you go to market, because I didn't have that, and sometimes I had to make it up on the spot, and it wasn't always particularly persuasive, I don't think.
Okay, so you did this for about, I think, five and a half years, pushing 6. Then you spend nearly 3 years at TikTok, right?
Yes, correct.
As marketing and promotion lead. My first question is, what was it like? What is it like working at TikTok?
It's crazy. I mean, it's crazy in a positive connotation. I'd worked with platforms as an outsider for so long, and so I didn't really have any comparison point as to what it was going to be like getting in there. I think it takes a lot of getting used to in terms of the demand for your time and the demand for access that people have. And I used to give certain DSPs, no names, like a bit of grief for not being accessible. And then I stepped into TikTok and suddenly everybody wants to take you to dinner and wants to pick your brains and wants to have a chat and such. And you're like, oh shit, I get it now. I get it now.
Yeah.
You are just completely overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And it was overwhelming. But at the same time, I joined at a really exciting time for the company where we just stepped into distribution with Sound On, and the aspirations for that were huge. And we got to hire some incredible people off the back of me joining and such as well. I got to work with amazing people, not just in music, but in sort of tech and data and on the product side as well. And it was a learning curve for me because I had to apply my knowledge and experience and expertise to a tech backdrop, which is challenging in its own way because they have different standards. They don't necessarily care about nuances or emotional things. They want to see hard data and understand why that data relates to a positive outcome for the business. And I think I struggled with that for a long time because in music, and you'll understand this, sometimes it's as simple as sitting down with somebody in a quiet room and having a conversation over dinner and then coming away with a business plan and something that can be actioned and tangible. You try and have that conversation with somebody who's done 10 years at Uber and now works at TikTok and is in charge of productizing certain things within the music industry. That's not going to float. They don't work like that. And maybe for the better, to be fair. I quite like doing my business in Simmons Wine Bar once in a while, but maybe that's actually something of a more mature thing. And I think anybody stepping into tech for the first time probably has this whole sort of realization where the accountability is far stronger. I think you constantly have to show you're working out. And I'll be honest, I gave myself 6 months because I said, this is either going to be a complete nightmare. I'm going to be, just walking in there. I'm not going to be able to get the respect of these people. I'm not going to be able to actually deliver anything and such. And so the fact that I came out after 3 years, I'm very grateful for because I got to stick around and see a lot of the projects come to fruition. I think the work we were able to do in creator marketing and really digging into the science of what people can do with creator marketing in the context of promoting music. I mean, that's stuff that still to this day I'm having to educate people in outside of the building and such and work around. So it was a challenge. I'm not going to lie and say that it was always, like really, really amazing because I think everybody wants access now. Everybody wants to be on TikTok. Everybody wants access to the latest tools. But what we were able to do was work really closely with certain labels and artists to create these great showcases for how TikTok is a powerful good in the music. And I still, to this day, I will not hear anybody tell me that TikTok is not fundamentally one of the most important tools to artists and labels in modern marketing and promotion. I mean, there just isn't a world in which that's true. I don't mind if you don't want to use it. That's your choice. That's 100% your choice. But telling me that TikTok's not relevant to your audience, I'm sorry, that the audience is just too big now. That's just telling me that you can't be bothered to work out where they are on the app.
Well, you're slightly out of touch, right? I think that's the other thing.
Your words, not mine.
Well, this leads me on to a discussion point. What was you? I mean, I think you might have left by this point, but the TikTok Universal thing happened.
You know when that was resolved? That was resolved the day before my wedding.
Oh wow!
And
you're still there at this point?
I'm still there at this point.
Okay.
And I was wondering if a couple of people from TikTok were going to turn up to my wedding, given
right
how close. But hey,
so what was your take on how that all unfolded?
It was disruptive, and I think it was disruptive to the artists releasing or who had released on Universal. And I think there was just a very big point in time where people wanted to know when their music was going to be back on the platform, which is a valid question. And, just to be clear, I wasn't sat in the room negotiating with Universal or anything like that. So I can only speak from my perspective and an outsider looking in now, right? But I think it went on for longer than it should have. And I'm glad that everybody did come back to the table again, because at the end of the day, the platform is better for having all of the world's music on it.
Totally. Well, I guess the thing that we spoke about before we started is you've now got this thing happening with Merlin. So, like, is this going to just keep on happening? Like, what does this mean for Merlin? What does this mean for TikTok?
I mean, the same nuances of the Universal discussion are, of course, relevant to the indies. And I think it was very easy for people to jump on the bandwagon of Universal. And I mean, I see a lot of people jumping on the bandwagon of hating majors and giving majors a hard time. And, I have nothing against majors. I think they have an important part in this industry. I don't think they're always the solution or they're always the right partner for people. But generally speaking, they have their place in this ecosystem. Merlin is an interesting situation because it's a conglomerate of labels, essentially, right? And so what you have now is an opportunity for all of these labels to potentially strike their own deals directly. Now, personally, if I'm a label owner, that's what I want to do from the outset. If you're part of a conglomerate such as Merlin, it's because they offer you some benefits or some added value. Now, from what I'm hearing, and I can only go by conversations I'm having or I'm echoing, independent labels are now starting to think, right, what are the benefits of being part of a conglomerate? How do we do what's best for us and our catalogue and our releases? And I guess that's going to be the interesting thing. Can Merlin come back to the table? My understanding is that currently there is no discussion for a renewal happening. And as a result, direct deals will be the way forward. And we've seen what happens now when you don't strike a deal and the music comes down. Nobody wants that. And on the scale of how many labels Merlin has, you've got to hope that doesn't happen, because that's just bad for the industry. It's a bad look. Like I say, I would hope that people can learn from the Universal situation, and hopefully that will make finding a solution a bit easier, let's say. But at the same time, TikTok's evolving, TikTok's changing. Now they've very publicly stated that they're not pursuing the streaming model anymore with TikTok Music. That they're going to be focusing on their current offering, short form video, the use of music on that platform. I mean, to be honest, when I saw that announcement come out, a couple of months after leaving TikTok, I was like, oh, for God's sake, because to be honest, that conversation was so contentious when I was at TikTok and, trying to remain pally with all the streaming platforms and such. While they're going, but are you going to be a competitor to us soon? And now it feels like more than ever, TikTok is an ally to these platforms, and it is part of the ecosystem that funnels more eyes and ears to those platforms. So, as TikTok changes and evolves, of course, the way that labels and artists work with it is going to change. So, I think this is going to become the new norm in terms of like renegotiations and such. I hope it can become less public, I think, and maybe we can do a bit more business behind closed doors, because, and again, this isn't to point fingers at specific journalists or anything like that, but I don't think the business benefits from a sort of tabloid approach to, oh, well, Lucian Grange said this, and oh, well, Ola said this, and it's just like, it doesn't need to be like that. We just need to do the business that is best for the artists and for their releases. And as long as that remains the focus, then I think TikTok's going to continue being a powerhouse, not only to the majors, but to the indies, which it already is. Yeah,
okay. Well, I mean, I guess that for me, I don't think there's ever been any argument in terms of how powerful TikTok can be as a marketing tool. And I want to come back to discussing the marketing, but one of the things I want to go back to is Avicii.
Yeah.
You've worked with Avicii, who's one of the biggest artists we've had in recent times. What was it like being a part of his team during his peak years?
It was quite crazy. And I mean, the specific album I got to be a part of was his sophomore album. So it felt like more than ever there was this level of scrutiny because the first album had been so polarizing in terms of, Wake Me Up. Most people were texting me saying, oh, he's blown it, that single's the end of it, and actually it was the start, if anything, I think, in terms of his mainstream appeal. So for Stories, I feel like people sort of sat there waiting to say, like, all right, what have you got now? And so it was about, we had so much material to choose from, and again, not that I was choosing or anything, but when I say, there's 10 or 11 records on it, there could have been 20 or 30, but the ones they chose, I think, were the right ones. I think that shows in the fact that 2 of the singles have had more than 1 billion streams, and the rest of the album still continues to stream incredibly well. But yeah, it was interesting because he had become this star, like this sensation, but he was still such a humble guy who just seemed to want to make his music and crack on. And I kind of loved that about him because it was really just about music. And he was so passionate about making the music as well. And so, I think a lot of people seem to be waiting for us to drop the ball or fail, for sure. So glad we didn't and such. But it was very interesting. And I mean, the fact that it also worked and translated outside of Sweden was definitely very, humbling. Like to see it actually chart here in the UK and the US as well, and the types of media we were able to do and such. And to be fair, it was such a huge team effort as well. Universal really threw a lot of manpower at it. I really sort of saw different territories step up in very unique ways and such. And so, it's with a project that size, you can't point to 1 or 2 people because there's probably about 40 people that should be singled out and given a pat on the back for that entire thing.
Amazing. Okay, well, I mean, you've had the experience of working with major artists like Avicii, but also independent artists. When it comes to marketing an independent artist or a major label artist, what are the kind of key differences in strategies?
I feel like for an independent artist or label, you've probably got to be a little bit more precise, because the one thing that major labels generally have more of is hands on deck and finances, right? And so the indies are competing with that. They are competing with these huge campaigns, like let's say Charlie XX with Brat, for example, which has just been everywhere and had so much resource and that thrown at it. If you're a pop artist, self DIY or releasing through an independent label, and you're trying to match that, you've got to cut through the noise with far less budget and far less people doing it for you. And that's a challenge. But luckily, I feel like the digital spaces in music have been democratized a bit more, in that you can find the right viral trend to ride on TikTok that will get you the same eyes and ears as those people. You can be savvy about how you use all these individual channels to your advantage. Like YouTube, I think, is one of the most slept on powerhouses that people can and should be getting more engaged with, as well as stuff, more traditional stuff like DSPs and that, because not only is it about how music's consumed, but you have the opportunity to be more creative with it and to multi-purpose your creativity across shorts and the long form and such. And so I think the main difference is you have to be a bit more tactile and you have to really make every shot you take count. Whereas I think the majors can probably afford to trial and error a little bit more. And you'll see that, but then also I think that makes people a bit more intentional with their marketing. So I think being intentional and definitely working out like, right, this is what we're trying to achieve with our marketing here, and this is how we're going to ride that. And then maybe working out also when to take your foot off the gas, because if you don't have the same financial resources as a major label has, it can be very easy for you to waste your budget trying to compete with them and trying to keep up with them. And so I would definitely advise people not to do that unless you do have a rich benefactor. Okay. All right. Well, listen, you've been involved in some incredible campaigns, and I actually asked you before we started, like, if you had any highlight campaigns. Shermanology, Boys in the Club, one of your highlight campaigns. Explain why. I think in the first instance, it's a highlight for me because Andy and Dorothy have been friends of mine since I was 19. I remember meeting them on the first ADE I ever went to, and just been really humbled by how down to earth they were, and we all loved the same music and that. And then I got to manage them when I was at Unapologetic, or had Unapologetic Group, and for a couple of years. And then this one was so interesting because it was essentially Andy coming to me saying, hey, look, we've got this record. None of the labels want to release it, but we really believe in it. Could you help us self-release it? And I heard the record, and straight away I was like, absolutely, I am in on this. I'm in on this. And I was really surprised because, not to name names, but a lot of labels passed on it, who 2 months later were in my inbox asking if we think about licensing it to them and such. And so, and it was just very validating. But we had a shoestring budget. It was COVID.
Can we go into numbers? What is shoestring?
I shouldn't go into numbers specifically, but it was very low.
Yeah, okay.
It was very low because we were self-funding it. We were doing it for that. It was COVID, so there was no clubs, and it's a club record for all intents and purposes. So there was that challenge as well. And so what I realised was all we had at our mercy was streaming, radio, and social, and that was it. And so we were really able to double down on getting the record to a certain level at radio, and then timing how we got our partners at streaming to get on board simultaneously. And I think Shazam was a huge help to us there as well, because what you saw was as you moved from the sort of specialist shows into the more daytime crowd on radio, you'd then start seeing the Shazams pick up, and then you could see that directly going back to the DSPs and how that grew as well. Getting the radio edit out helped as well. And to be honest, we hadn't anticipated that we'd need a radio edit for that particular record. So it was just very validating to, on, you know, several £1,000s, let's say, get a record into the UK Top 40, into the Radio 1A list, into all the big playlists and properties across Spotify and Apple Music. And it just, again, those conversations where the same labels that have turned around to somebody and said, no, this record will never work, come back saying like, wow, this is working, we want to be on board. Like, I don't know, I'm a bit of a smug prick. I kind of enjoyed that, to be honest.
Okay, so, but I guess now, when you look back at that campaign, which you've said is like one of your highlights, is like, is there one specific thing you can pick out and go, that was the key ingredient?
I think the key ingredient was marketing to the audience we had, and also knowing what the aspiration was for a wider audience. So obviously by the time you're onto 80 million streams, you're not just marketing to dance music fans there. You're crossing into a far more broad spectrum there, I think. And it was literally, we only had a handful of tools at our mercy. We couldn't go on the road. We literally couldn't go on the road. We couldn't do a press tour. We couldn't get them into the studios at all these different radio stations or anything. But what we could do was time how the record hit the world very precisely and ride that wave. And I think that's what we were able to do. And what was good about it was the investment we made has paid dividends. It got their monthly listeners up to the highest it's ever been. It started a trajectory where there were more offers coming in. They were able to work with other labels. They went on to do a great collab with Fisher off the back of that as well and such. So, and again, that's more credit to them than anything. But again, I think sometimes timing and just really honing in on a couple of very specific marketing tools. Yeah. That's all you need sometimes.
Okay.
I mean, don't get me wrong, a bigger budget would have been amazing, but at the same time, I'm very proud of what we were able to do with it.
Okay, so that was a dance single we're talking about. I'd like to talk about an album campaign, Zara Larsson's So Good.
Yeah.
Talk us through the success of that campaign.
I mean, it was an interesting one because I was coming at it essentially working with her management in Sweden, 10 Music Group, and then collaborating quite closely with Roger and the team over in the UK and such. And it was interesting because she was a household name in Sweden and still had so much to prove in the rest of the world. And there'd been some success with some early singles such as Lush Life and Never Forget You, but those had happened in completely different territories as well. So I think So Good was kind of an opportunity to bring that all together and find something that could cement her as the next up and comer. And I think this was also at a time where Dua Lipa was still cutting through. She hadn't quite found her sort of hook yet. So there was a slight gap in the market. And to be honest, I think it was just about bringing the best possible assets together from these priority territories. So there was a lot of coordination to be done. She had, brand deals with H&M ongoing, like a capsule collection. She had an ongoing thing with Nike simultaneously, if I remember correctly, and then there were all these moving parts that had to come together, and then it was just about working out, like, right, how do we tell the story with the reality that different records are doing different things in different territories. And so it was complicated, and again, there were so many different teams involved. So, you know, you had Epic in the US, you had Black Butter over here, then you had Sony Sweden and 10 Music Group, and so it's just kind of getting everyone together and saying, like, right, if this is what we're trying to achieve, this is the plan. This territory, you can do your thing. This territory, you can do your thing. But this is the central plan. And to be honest as well, it didn't hurt that she had the success of the Symphony with Clean Bandit simultaneously, which, you know, again, was added onto the overall package of the album. But I think that was a really good way of sort of cementing her status as an up-and-comer and saying, right, here's a conversation piece. Now come and check out her debut international album.
Yeah, amazing. I would like to talk about your new venture, Carter Projects, because obviously this is your baby now, your new baby.
It is.
But actually, before we get to that, I'd like to get your take on not necessarily the state of the music industry now, but where you think we're headed, whether that be, you know, more opportunity for independent artists or whether that's impact from technology. What do you think's around the corner for the music industry?
I think that generally speaking, there is a bid for more independence and more infrastructure for independent music. And I think now more than ever, you have the platforms and tools that can help supplement marketing and promotional efforts for independence. You don't have to go and sign to the major labels to get that kind of service. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't sign to the major labels, because there are some artists who, quite frankly, work great in the major label system and can benefit from their impact on radio and streaming and the collateral that they have. But generally speaking, I think you can have DIY artists, you know, scaling the Spotify charts and finding that success. In terms of where we're moving, I think there's a lot of bids for ownership, whether that's ownership of your rights, whether that's ownership of your audience and such. I think people don't want to rent their crowds anymore, if you know what I mean. I think they want to be able to point to the people that they want to communicate with and they want to push their music to, and just controlling that entire ecosystem seems to be an incredibly important subject right now.
When you say renting their audience, are you talking about social platforms?
Well, yeah, yes and no. Social platforms, yes, for sure. But then for some people, if Spotify disappeared overnight, they would lose their audience. And some people, again, no names, have done very well and built great careers based on playing the game and having placements in owned playlists, for example, like editorial playlists on Spotify and Apple. Now, what happens, God forbid, if overnight Spotify disappears and suddenly you've only got Apple Music and YouTube and Amazon, and you haven't had any repertoire or any effort to push your music to those platforms or to build streams independently, full stop. Suddenly you have this huge gap and that could be catastrophic. And so I think it's all very well getting on playlists. It's all very well having that repertoire. Everyone loves seeing their face on a billboard in Times Square. I get it, right?
Yeah.
But there needs to be ownership of how you push your record to audiences, be that through digital advertising, be that through owning a community hub where you can actually control the narrative and when you speak to people and how you speak to people. I think that's becoming more and more important. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be then also working directly with DSPs where you can. I mean, that's been a huge asset to me and my rosters over the years. But at the same time, you need to be able to speak directly to people. And sometimes it's also the industry seems to be a little bit too comfortable with not actually knowing who their audience is. And now, with the data we have access to and all of these other factors, I just don't think there's an excuse for that anymore, personally.
When you say, like, for example, you said, you know, Spotify disappeared tomorrow, what would happen? Like, in my view, if Spotify disappears and you've got all that attention on all those users there, well, they just go somewhere else, right? They'd go to Amazon, they go to Apple or YouTube. So is your point that if you're focusing all your attention on Spotify, then there's a problem?
I'm not sure if that was the point I was making, but that is a problem. I think I've always said that you need to have parity across all the relevant platforms. And I think now more than ever, there is a healthy diversification between what each streaming platform can offer and does as well to some extent. But I think there just should be more ownership of audience data, I think is the point I'm trying to get to. And while you do get great analytics from the individual platforms and such as well, I think you should also have some control over how you're driving traffic to those streaming platforms.
One of the things I'm hearing more and more when we're talking about independent artists and owning your audience, and it seems strange because it seems so old school in some respect, but mailing lists, like something as simple as that is...
I love a mailing list. When I am talking to a potential client or somebody and they turn around and say, oh yeah, and this is our mailing list and this is how active it is. And so, I mean, I'll tell you what, that's like dirty talk to me. I'm telling you, you cannot beat a well-managed GDP compliant mailing list, I'm telling you. But it's again though, I feel like we're going back in time a little bit where the function of a mailing list is what people are trying to do now through Discord groups and through other platforms like that. And I think people just appreciate the ability to send a message to some really engaged fans at any given time, and being able to segment your fans into these are the ones that we know listen, but won't necessarily buy a t-shirt. These are the fans who we know have purchased a piece of merch or have, invested more heavily than this one. And these are our super fans. They will literally jump off a cliff if we tell them to. Like, just having that mentality and being able to start segmenting an owned channel to those people, that is a superpower. And some people are doing it far better than others. I think this is where indies can really start, picking up a bit more momentum in terms of independent artists, let's say, in terms of like owning that from the outset. Because even if it just starts off with 30 to 50 people, right, that's still 30 to 50 people that you can talk directly to. And I think that's slightly more valuable than 50,000 monthly listeners on Spotify, personally.
Okay, so I want to sort of recap on this point by asking you the question, what are the best ways a independent artist can own their audience?
I think establish the channel that's going to be the most powerful to you long term, and that can be a bit of trial and error, I think, in the first instance, but work out what platform's going to serve you best, actually devise a long-term strategy for how you can grow that, and assess if it's working or not, and don't be too proud to turn around and say, actually, you know what, this hasn't worked, so let's pivot, let's do it. And then again, I think just working out whether it's digital advertising, whether it's channel management, and being very intentional with how you use certain channels and how you push your creative content through those channels, and then create a funnel for how you can then attract people from those channels to start signing up for longer term communication, let's say. I think that's the mentality you have to treat it all with and such. And again, there are so many channels, so it can be quite overwhelming, I think, to know which is the right channel. But that varies by genre, that varies by territory. So that's I work internationally, right? So that conversation goes very differently with different genres and different territories. But
okay, great segue, because you're obviously very passionate about driving these opportunities for independent artists, and along comes Carter Projects, which is launching very soon. Tell us the vision for this new venture and how you hope it's going to impact the industry.
Yeah, so I just found that while I was at TikTok and I was talking to all these amazing label teams and such about how they were promoting their music, how they were marketing their music, and who they were working with to do so outside of their own buildings, it all just felt really fragmented to me. And it just felt like, especially in the independent sector, you could end up having 5 or 6 different agencies doing one album project, let's say, in a way that actually just felt, A, not cost effective, but B, just not quite intuitive enough, because it was so fragmented and you weren't necessarily owning all of the data that was coming in, or you weren't necessarily like able to point that to a longer term vision. So really with Carter Projects, it sounds way fancier than it is. It's consultancy. It's me actually being able to get under the bonnet with these clients. It's me being able to sit down with very specific clients, audit their business, look at where they're at right now, look at how those channels are serving them, look at whether they're being served efficiently or not, and then fill in the gaps. And I mean, I'm one of those guys, I just like getting in the trenches. I like getting my hands dirty. I like selling records. I'm a records guy. I always have been, always will be. And from the early days of my career, I worked out that I got the biggest kick from blowing up records and for really like doubling down and selling these records and giving them the international scope that they deserved. And I think now coming out and seeing what good TikTok does to these records, but then also knowing very much that YouTube is a really important piece of the puzzle. Short form content and marketing records across all of the short form verticals. So TikTok is very important, but you've got shorts, you've got reels, you've got all of these platforms where similar science and strategies can pay huge dividends. And I think bringing that all together and packaging it in a way that you can just provide this hugely detailed and very high value service, that's my North Star right now. I'm trying to make it as... I was trying to work out what the opposite of fragmented was there in despair, but just trying to bring it all together. And so it's really doing more for less people, which I think is the best way to do it, and probably something I didn't do with my first proper company, Unapologetic. I think then I was doing sort of bits and pieces for lots of people, which was very gratifying at the time and did it, but now it's about really specializing and educating as well. I think the one thing that I enjoyed doing the most at TikTok was sitting down with these label teams and telling them what they could do to make their efforts better and making sure they had access to all the right tools. And I worked out I can still do that from outside the building, but with more partners as well, which is really exciting to me.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, listen, mate, to be honest, I think we can wrap it up there. I think there's some amazing things we've touched on. I think what you're doing with Carter Project sounds very promising. When do you launch?
I'll be launching in 2 weeks at ADE. So I'm doing a panel out there, and that's going to be kind of the first time I'm publicly talking not only about the clients, but sort of the fuller scope. And it's very exciting. I'm looking forward to lifting the veil on it a bit. I think a few people assumed I'd just retired and we're just living at the Emirates now. But
yeah. Okay, well, listen, mate, best of luck with Carter Projects.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming on, and we'll speak again soon.
Absolute pleasure, man. Thank you.
Nice one.